The air in the command bunker was thick, not with cigar smoke but with the suffocating certainty of defeat. It is April 1945. Location: the Oder Front, just east of Berlin. The ground trembles, not from the customary rumble of German tanks, but from the relentless earth-shaking advance of the Soviet Red Army. It is the sound of historical reckoning, a choir of Katyusha rockets and artillery fire that to the ears of the German High Command sounded less like a battle and more like the end of the world. For the men fighting under the banner of the Wehrmacht, the reality was brutal enough. But for those wearing the double lightning bolts, the Schutzstaffel, SS, the terror was existential. Their entire existence, built on ideological fervor and the perpetration of unimaginable crimes, had been predicated on avoiding this very moment. They had been the architects of the war's darkest policies, and they knew, with chilling clarity, that the Soviet Union would not offer the customary mercy of the battlefield. For them, surrender to the East was not an end. It was the beginning of an inevitable, brutal retribution. This, then, is the central irony of the final weeks of World War II. The regime built on fanaticism, the one that preached absolute loyalty unto death, found its most feared warriors engaged in a desperate, humiliating, and utterly pragmatic race for survival. The SS, which once saw itself as the vanguard of a thousand-year Reich, now saw the Americans, their sworn capitalist enemies, as their only possible saviors. The strategic reality of the final collapse was governed by logistics and geography. Across the fractured landscape of Germany, SS units, from the hardened panzer crews of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte to the administrative battalions guarding concentration camps, began to execute unauthorized, localized withdrawals. The official orders from the Führer bunker were simple: hold the line or die. But as Colonel Jochen Peiper, a notorious SS commander, later recounted in post-war interviews, the orders from Berlin became meaningless. They were the ravings of madmen. Our only duty became survival, and for some, the preservation of our own hides. The technical challenge of this retreat was immense. The Reich's once vaunted rail network was shredded by Allied air supremacy. Fuel was non-existent. The only way west was on foot, or in slow, vulnerable convoys, often using wood gas generators or horses, a humiliating concession for a force that had defined blitzkrieg. This operational impotence fueled the psychological collapse. They were no longer masters of the battlefield but hunted men, driven by the primordial fear of the approaching red tide. In the West, American and British troops, having crossed the Rhine, were advancing at a staggering pace. Their advance was a display of unparalleled industrial and logistical power. The sheer volume of Sherman tanks, M4A3E8 model, the unstoppable flow of GMC CCKW deuce-and-a-half trucks ferrying supplies along the famous Red Ball Express routes, and the constant presence of P-47 Thunderbolts overhead, created an impression of overwhelming, effortless strength. For the SS men facing this force, it was not just a military confrontation, it was a surrender to modernity itself. They saw an army with hot food, endless fuel, and the casual indifference of assured victory. The desperation manifested in clandestine efforts to make contact. The irony deepened. The SS, masters of clandestine operations, were now trying to contact the enemy's intelligence arms, the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, hoping to barter information, secrets, technology, perhaps even the location of Nazi gold, for safe passage and the protection of a POW camp under Western jurisdiction. This wasn't merely a strategic military surrender, it was a desperate transactional plea. One common though unofficial channel was through the lower-ranking Wehrmacht officers, who often initiated the first white flag and then offered up the details of the nearest, most feared SS units. They wanted to earn points, a US Third Army intelligence officer noted in a private journal. The moment they saw our insignia, they were practically tripping over themselves to point out the nearest Schutzstaffel barracks. The stench of their fear was palpable, and we used it. The SS leadership, realizing their precarious position, began to circulate vague, unwritten orders, instructing units to prioritize movement towards American-held sectors, often disregarding direct orders from Hitler. The official stance was fight to the death, but the tacit understanding was survive at all costs. This dual reality, the fanatical propaganda from Berlin versus the cold, self-preserving pragmatism in the field, became the defining psychological landscape of the final campaign. It was an environment ripe for suspense, betrayal, and unexpected human drama. The American GI's perception of the SS was absolute. They were ideological fanatics, the worst of the worst. Yet standing before a line of terrified, disarmed men in the black or field grey uniforms, the situation was complex. Who was the true enemy now? The man who was ordered to commit an atrocity, or the ideology that commanded it? The practical need for intelligence and rapid cessation of hostilities often superseded the immediate desire for moral justice. This internal tension within the Allied command became a critical factor in how these surrenders were handled, a tension that the desperate SS men hoped to exploit. As we turn our gaze from the crumbling Eastern Front toward the rapidly moving Allied lines, the true drama unfolds, a lethal game of hide-and-seek where the stakes were not territory but life, and where the most feared soldiers of the Third Reich were reduced to beggars, risking execution by their own commanders to avoid the ultimate punishment from the East. The clock was ticking, and the shadows of Soviet retribution stretched longer and longer across the dwindling German map. If you're finding this deep dive into the human and strategic complexities of the war's final days compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing historically accurate, high-quality narratives to life. The smell of spring mud and burnt gunpowder hung over the roads leading into Bavaria. For the U.S. 7th Army, the advance in March and April 1945 felt almost abstract, a matter of moving the map pins faster than the cartographers could update them. The primary enemy was collapsing, yet the pockets of resistance, particularly those manned by SS units, were characterized by a brutal, sporadic fanaticism. Here lies the strategic puzzle. How do you treat an enemy that alternates between suicidal resistance and abject, unsolicited surrender? American operational doctrine was clear: capture and neutralize. But the presence of the SS, designated by Allied command as a criminal organization, introduced immediate ethical and logistical dilemmas. The standard operating procedure for a Wehrmacht soldier was processing and transfer to a prisoner of war POW camp under the protection of the Geneva Convention. For the SS, the future was far murkier. From a technological and tactical perspective, the Allied advance was a masterpiece of combined arms. The M8 Greyhound armored car, fast and nimble, often scouted ahead, its crew risking sudden ambush from a hidden SS Panzerfaust team. Behind them rolled the tanks and, crucially, the massive logistics tail. The American advantage was not just in hardware like the M1 Garand rifle, a superior semi-automatic weapon that gave the GI massive firepower advantage over the bolt-action Kar-98K, but in the sheer scale of their industrial supply chain. For an SS officer like Major Klaus Richter, a pseudonym based on multiple historical accounts, commanding a shattered Kampfgruppe near the Weser River, the American industrial power was the real enemy. We still had the quality, the Tiger tanks, the MP-40s, Richter allegedly recounted to his captors, but you had the quantity, and you had the air. Our greatest fear was not the man on the ground, but the sun, because it meant you were coming. The decision to surrender to the West was often a calculated, high-stakes gamble. The SS men knew the risk. If caught by their own Feldgendarmerie, military police, they faced immediate execution for treason. Yet the alternative, the Red Army, was viewed as a certainty of a worse fate. The narrative suspense was built on the knife edge of a forced encounter. Imagine a jeep carrying Captain Thomas Reed of the 9th Infantry Division, scouting a forward position, suddenly confronted by a small group of SS men, hands raised, faces streaked with grime and terror. This was not the arrogant, triumphant SS of 1940. These were fugitives. Captain Reed's immediate dilemma. 1. Compliance. Accept the surrender, ensuring the prisoners are secured and treated according to the rules of engagement, despite the clear historical mandate to view them as war criminals. 2. Rejection. Drive them away, effectively condemning them to the Soviets, a move that would violate the moral code of the U.S. Army, even against such a despised enemy. 3. Exploitation. secure them immediately for intelligence, hoping to gain crucial data on remaining resistance or, more importantly, the location of senior Nazi figures or military technology, the so-called V-weapons and jet aircraft secrets. In reality, the OSS and US Army intelligence often had standing directives to prioritize the acquisition of high-value targets, including specific SS technologists and intelligence officers. These directives created an ironic incentive for certain SS units to come in from the cold. Their desperation was their bargaining chip. They could offer expertise in areas like rocketry, V2 program, synthetic fuels, or secret archives, hoping to trade technology for amnesty, or at least Western custody. We saw them as a gift from the sky, stated a US Ordnance Corps engineer tasked with capturing German rocket technology. The moment we confirmed a Schutzstaffel technical unit was trying to surrender, our tactical priority shifted instantly. We didn't care about the combat unit, we wanted the brainpower. It was morally repugnant, but strategically essential. The average American GI, however, had a more visceral reaction. After witnessing the liberation of concentration camps like Buchenwald or Dachau, where the sheer organized horror was undeniable, the sight of an SS uniform evoked rage. There are numerous recorded incidents where American troops, enraged by the sights of the camps, struggled to restrain themselves when confronted by their former guards. The military chain of command had to enforce a strict, often unpopular discipline to maintain control. The SS knew this. Their strategy, often implemented by lower-ranking non-ideological members of the unit, was to shed their uniforms, or at least their insignia, at the earliest opportunity, attempting to blend in with regular Wehrmacht soldiers or even civilians. But the Allied intelligence was often one step ahead, using aerial reconnaissance and captured documents to identify unit markings and known SS assembly points. This chapter of the war was characterized by a moral and tactical tightrope walk. The Americans were winning the war, but they risked losing their moral authority by being forced into a strange, unholy alliance with the enemy's most feared elements. The SS, masters of cruelty, were forced into the ultimate act of humiliation, relying on the decency and rule of law of the very people they had tried to annihilate. The race to the West was a race against the clock, against the Soviets, and against the historical memory of their own crimes. The strategic landscape of 1945 was defined by the relentless pressure of Allied air power, a technology the SS had consistently underestimated. The high-altitude surveillance provided by Spitfire PR-19 photo-reconnaissance aircraft and the precision bombing by Mosquito fighter bombers meant that no major SS movement toward the west went unnoticed. This aerial dominance stripped the SS of their most precious commodity, operational secrecy. But the SS units weren't just fleeing with small arms. They were carrying the hidden baggage of a crumbling empire, technological secrets, looted wealth and incriminating documents. Their desperate flight to the Western Allies was often a frantic effort to safeguard these assets, not just for personal gain, but for the dark hope of a post-war resurgence or, at the very least, a valuable bargaining chip. One of the most intense areas of focus for Allied intelligence was the capture of German technological marvels, specifically the jet and rocket programs largely managed under SS purview. The Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter, and the V-2 rocket, the precursor to all modern ballistic missiles, represented the apex of Axis engineering. The SS technicians and scientists responsible for these projects became the ultimate prize in the race to the West. Consider the complexity of the V-2 program. Housed largely in the massive underground Mittelwerk factory, also known as Dora, the scientists, many of them members of the SS or closely supervised by them, knew that their value was paramount. Their surrender was often coordinated, not impulsive. They understood the American appetite for this technology and initiated contact through pre-arranged intermediaries or by deliberately leaving behind trail markers for Allied intelligence. This calculated risk was the SS's most significant tactical success in the final months, using the enemy's strategic desire to ensure their own survival. A key challenge was the transportation of documents and prototypes. The SS often employed specialized camouflaged convoys, prioritizing trucks carrying crates marked Critical personnel records, often containing gold, foreign currency, or technical blueprints over common supplies. These convoys were heavily guarded, not against the Americans, but against disillusioned Wehrmacht troops or desperate German civilians who might recognize the value of the cargo. The SS was fighting a three-way war against the Allies, the Soviets, and increasingly against internal dissent and opportunism. The logistical collapse on the German side was accelerated by the lack of fuel, a technological vulnerability the Allies exploited mercilessly. German tanks, even the superior Tiger II, Königstiger, were useless without the specialized synthetic fuel they relied on. The SS, therefore, had to rely on whatever captured or antiquated vehicles they could find, significantly slowing their movements. This reduced the SS Panzer divisions, once the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, to static defense points or slow-moving caravans, making them easier targets for the American P-51 Mustang fighter bombers, which specialized in low-level ground attacks. The intelligence value of the SS surrenders was twofold. First, they provided immediate tactical data, minefield locations, troop concentrations, and the whereabouts of senior commanders. Second, and far more significant for the post-war world, they provided personnel and documents for Operation Paperclip and other secret Allied projects designed to secure Axis intellectual property. The sheer scale of this acquisition was staggering. The documentation on advanced German optics, infrared technology, and crucially rocketry and aerodynamics was enormous. "We took in what they called technical luggage," an OSS operative stated, "and it was the blueprint for the next 20 years of military aviation. The cost of that knowledge was having to look an SS man in the eye and treat him with an enforced professionalism. That was the price." But the SS desperation also led to instances of profound betrayal and internal division. As units began to splinter, commanders who wished to fight to the bitter end found themselves overruled, and sometimes even murdered by their subordinates seeking surrender. The once rigid monolithic structure of the SS was fractured by self-interest and survival instinct. The discipline that had been their trademark was replaced by a brutal Darwinian scramble. The technical failure of the Nazi war machine, its inability to match Allied production, and its reliance on vulnerable supply lines, was what ultimately forced the SS to make this desperate leap of faith toward their Western enemies. They were sacrificing their ideological integrity, their uniforms, and their loyalty to the Führer, all in a last frantic bid to escape the inevitable judgment approaching from the East. Their hidden baggage, the blueprints, the gold, the technology, was not a sign of strength but the last pathetic currency of a defeated regime trying to buy its way out of damnation. The sheer number of German soldiers surrendering in the final weeks of the war created a logistical nightmare for the Western Allies. The scale was biblical: over 4 million German soldiers were captured by the Western Allies by the end of the war, and a disproportionate number of these were frantically trying to cross the demarcation lines in April and May 1945. This deluge of prisoners, many of them SS, tested the integrity of the Allied command structure and the moral compass of the individual GI. The rules of war, specifically the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Convention, were the moral gauntlet through which the SS men were forced to pass. The Allied command was legally and morally obligated to treat all surrendering soldiers as prisoners of war, POWs, regardless of their affiliation. However, the SS had been designated a criminal organization distinct from the regular army, Wehrmacht. This created a loophole, which the SS desperately tried to exploit, while the Allies tried to navigate without compromising their commitment to the rule of law. The suspense in these encounters was often rooted in the tension between the Allied soldiers' personal rage and their professional duty. Imagine a guard duty at a massive American-run Rhine Meadow lager, a massive open-air detention camp. An SS officer, attempting to appear cooperative and non-threatening, approaches an American sergeant who just weeks earlier saw the victims of the Schutzstaffel at a liberated camp. This sergeant's dilemma encapsulates the entire moral gauntlet. He is guarding a man whose organization is responsible for the murder of millions, yet he must ensure the man receives adequate food and medical care. "It felt wrong," recalled Private First Class Henry Miller of the 101st Airborne. It felt like we were rewarding evil, but we were told, "We are not them. We follow the book." And that was the hardest fight of all, keeping the book. The SS units, realizing the Allied commitment to the Geneva Convention, often used it as a shield. They would be meticulously correct in their surrender protocol, demanding proper identification of the capturing unit, ensuring their personal effects were logged, and even demanding to speak to a commanding officer to negotiate their terms. This veneer of professionalism was an attempt to cover their criminal past with the procedural legitimacy of a formal military surrender. However, the Allies had countermeasures. Special intelligence teams, including members of the Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, were tasked with segregating the SS from the regular Wehrmacht and identifying known war criminals. Technology played a role here too. The CIC utilized early versions of punch card sorting machines to cross-reference prisoner names and ranks against captured documents, the SS Stammrollen personnel lists, to separate the fanatics and perpetrators from the less involved personnel. The key historical contradiction was that while the Allies were committed to trying the SS leadership at Nuremberg, they were simultaneously using the technical knowledge of certain SS-affiliated scientists and engineers. This pragmatic contradiction led to secret agreements and silent processing of high-value SS personnel, often bypassing the regular POW system. This was the ultimate moral sacrifice for strategic gain. The narratives from the field often highlight the raw, palpable fear of the SS men concerning Soviet capture. Report from an American interrogator, May 1945. The SS officer, a major in the Totenkopf division, wept openly. He didn't beg for his life, but for the guarantee of being moved west of the Elbe. He said, "The American bullet is clean, the Russian knife is long." His terror was not of death, but of the nature of his execution. It was pure, unadulterated self-preservation. This terror was the greatest strategic asset the Western Allies possessed against the SS. The knowledge that the SS would fight ferociously against the Soviets, but immediately seek surrender from the Americans, allowed Allied commanders to strategically advance on known SS strongholds from the West. Knowing that the resistance would often dissolve into a mass surrender the moment the SS realized they were safe. The final days were thus not defined by grand battles, but by a series of tense, localized moral standoffs. The Americans had to maintain their humanity, while holding the very people who had lost theirs. The SS had to rely on the enemy's rule of law, the ultimate ironic and necessary gamble, to save themselves from the consequences of their own lawlessness. The moral gauntlet was passed, but the historical and ethical questions surrounding the processing and selection of these desperate men would linger for decades. The war in Europe concluded with a thunderous silence on May 8, 1945. But for the SS units that had successfully navigated the race to the west, the drama was far from over. Their successful surrender to the American forces marked not an end, but a transition into a new, complex reality, defined by interrogation, accountability, and the long shadow of the East. The legacy of the SS's last gamble is threefold: the human cost, the strategic transfer, and the historical irony. For the individual SS man, the relief of being in Western custody quickly gave way to the fear of being identified as a war criminal. The Allies, particularly the CIC, meticulously worked to sort through the masses of prisoners. The task was massive, requiring the processing of millions of forms and the cross-referencing of witnesses. The American strategy was to separate the ideological and administrative SS, those involved in concentration camps or policy, from the common soldiers who may have been conscripted into SS combat divisions. For the latter, a period of denazification and eventual release was possible. For the former, the destination was Nuremberg and the subsequent trials. The narrative suspense in the immediate aftermath was focused on the interrogations. These were tense, high-stakes psychological battles. The SS men, often hardened veterans, tried to minimize their involvement, pleading the defense of "be feels not stand," duress of command. However, the precision of the Allied investigation was relentless. They used captured SS records and documents detailed in the famous Black Book of War Criminals to tie individuals to specific atrocities. The technology of the interrogation room was simple, mostly tape recorders and stacks of paper, but the psychological engineering was sophisticated. Interrogators exploited the SS man's terror of the East, often threatening them with transfer to the Soviets if they did not cooperate fully, a highly effective technique that yielded invaluable information. The most profound legacy of the SS's desperation was the strategic advantage it gave the West in the dawning Cold War. The influx of high-value SS scientists and technicians secured in the final days of the race to the West was an immediate, unlooked-for asset. The technology captured, the jet engines, the blueprints for long-range bombers, and most importantly the rocket science of men like Wernher von Braun, became the foundation for American military and space supremacy. This strategic gain required the Western Allies to make difficult, ethically compromised decisions, prioritizing technological acquisition over immediate, universal justice. This was the ultimate historical irony. The SS, built to destroy the West, inadvertently provided the West with the technology needed to win the impending global struggle against communism. The knowledge they possessed became their get-out-of-jail-free card, a dark, pragmatic exchange that reshaped the geopolitical map. The American P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational jet fighter in the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the early stages of the NASA space program all have technological roots, traceable directly to the final, desperate surrenders of SS personnel. The final image of the SS is not one of them dying heroically in a bunker, as their propaganda had demanded, but of them queuing in the thousands, stripped of their insignia, hoping to pass unnoticed into the safe anonymity of a Western POW camp. The irony is complete. The warriors of the thousand-year Reich were ultimately saved by the democratic rule of law they had vowed to obliterate. Their fanaticism was ultimately subsumed by the base, human instinct for survival. The moral complexity of this final act remains a powerful, troubling chapter. The SS, in their most desperate moment, gambled on the moral superiority of their enemy, a gamble that paid off for many, but not for history. Justice, though often delayed and sometimes strategically circumvented, was ultimately served through the courts, and for many, through the inescapable psychological burden of their actions. The race to the West was not a glorious last stand. It was a testament to the fact that even the most fanatical ideology collapses when confronted with the raw, self-preserving terror of death and the clear, overwhelming superiority of an enemy's industrial might and, critically, its commitment to established rules of engagement. The SS went out, not with a bang of final defiance, but with a whimper of desperate self-interest, seeking shelter under the flag of the very democracy they hated. Their legacy is a warning. The ultimate price of fanaticism is the loss of one's own humanity and the forfeiture of a dignified end. If this deep exploration of the moral and strategic complexities of the war's end has captured your interest, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are committed to unearthing the true, unvarnished stories of history's most pivotal moments.